This video may include content that could be upsetting for some viewers. I endeavour to collect as much factual information as possible from books, newspaper articles, autopsy reports, police reports and inquest information. I mean no harm to the families of the victims that I will speak about and only wish to bring awareness and attention to the individual cases and especially the unsolved cases. Jennifer Cardy was a 9-year-old girl from Ballinderry, County Antrim in Ireland. Jennifer left her home on the 12th of August at 1:40 p.m. so she would get to her friend's house by 2 p.m. Her friend Louise only lived a mile and a half away at the other end of County Antrim village in Ballinderry. As she finished her lunch of poached eggs with her brothers Philip and Mark, she asked her mother Patricia to wind up her red watch so she would be able to meet her friend Louise. Jennifer did not like to be late. As Jennifer cycled to her friend's house on her new red bike that she had got for her birthday just 2 weeks earlier, her mother didn't realise it would be the last time she would ever see her daughter again. On the 18th of August 1981, 2 anglers discovered 9-year-old Jennifer Cardy's body in a reservoir near a lay-by in Hillsborough. She was just 16 miles away from her home. Ultimately, that helped prove she was dumped by her killer just 4 hours after she pedalled off from her home to meet her friend Louise. The location of her body near a major road between Belfast and Dublin led police to suspect her murderer had been familiar with the area. The reservoir where her body was found was very near to a popular route that long-distance delivery drivers would often use. This was visible only yards away from a lay-by, suggesting that their killer may have travelled extensively there in the past. A pathologist later noted signs of sexual abuse on Jennifer's body and her underwear. The autopsy concluded she had died of drowning. Almost a year later, an 11-year-old girl also went missing. Susan Claire Maxwell, who lived on the English side of the Scottish border, was abducted on the 30th of July 1982 as she walked home from playing tennis in Coldstream. She was last seen alive at 4:30 p.m. crossing the bridge over the River Tweed and was very likely abducted shortly after. The following day, a search was mounted to find her. Search dogs were used to search for her and over 300 officers were assigned full-time. A thorough search was made of every property in both Cornhill and Coldstream and over 80 miles were searched. Several police and people reported having seen a white van in the locality at the time. One said a van had been parked in a field gateway just off of the A697. 13 days later, on the 12th of August, Susan Maxwell's body was found by a lorry driver. Her body was covered with undergrowth and clothed apart from her shoes and underwear. The precise date and cause of death could not be determined due to how much she had decomposed. Susan had been bound and gagged with sticking plaster and her underwear was removed and folded neatly beneath her head, suggesting that she had been sexually assaulted. A coroner's inquest concluded that they believed that Susan was alive for more than 24 hours after being taken. Again, with only a year's gap, on the 8th of July 1983, another abduction had taken place. This time it was a girl called Caroline Hogg. Caroline was just 5 years old. Caroline disappeared whilst playing outside her Beach Lane home in Edinburgh, a suburb of Portobello, in the early evening of the 8th of July. Caroline was due to be home at 7:15 that evening. When she failed to return home, her family searched the surrounding streets. A young boy told them he had seen Caroline with a man on the nearby promenade, which they had searched before they had called the Lothian Borders Police. By the 10th of July, Caroline Hogg's disappearance was the headline news across the UK. 9 known paedophiles were identified as having been in Portobello on the 8th of July, but all were eliminated from the inquiry. Numerous eyewitnesses had seen an unkempt, balding man wearing horn-rimmed glasses, watching Caroline as she played. He then followed her to a nearby fairground. A 14-year-old girl named Jennifer Booth had seen Caroline sitting with this man on a bench. Booth overheard Hogg reply, "Yes, please," to some question posed to her by the man, before the two walked off to the fairground holding hands. There, the man paid for Caroline to ride on the carousel as he watched her. An eyewitness stated to the police that as they left, Caroline seemed very frightened. 10 days after Caroline's abduction on the 18th of July, her naked body was found in a ditch close to the M1 motorway in Twycross, 310 miles, 500 kilometres from where she had been abducted, just 24 miles from where Susan Maxwell's body was found the previous year. The precise cause of death could not be determined due to the extent of decomposition. Insect activity suggested the body had been placed where it was found on or after the 12th of July. The absence of clothing, again, suggested a sexual motive. The following March, a televised reconstruction of the abduction was broadcast nationally, appealing for witnesses to come forward. Caroline's father said, "You think it will never happen to you, but it has proven time and time again that it can, and it could again if this man isn't caught in the near future." After the discovery of Caroline's body, police from both Staffordshire and Leicestershire police unanimously concluded that Caroline and Susan's killer were the same person. Due to the distances involved, police suspected that the murderer of Susan Maxwell and Caroline Hogg worked as a lorry or van driver or a sales representative, which required him to travel extensively to the locations throughout the Scottish borders. Both girls had been bound and likely subjected to a sexual assault prior to the murders, and each of them had been wearing white ankle socks at the time of the abductions. This may have triggered a fetish in the perpetrator's psyche. I would say most of the little girls at that age, including myself, during that time would have wore very similar ankle socks for school. Due to geographically and circumstantial natures of the offences, the killer was most likely an opportunist. Following the August 1982 discovery of Susan Maxwell's body, numerous transport firms with links between Scotland and the Midlands of England were contacted. The drivers were questioned about their whereabouts on the date of their abduction. This line of inquiry was repeated following the discovery of Caroline Hogg's body also, but in both instances failed to yield results. Despite frustration at the lack of a breakthrough in their search for the murderer, there was complete cooperation between the detectives from all 4 police forces involved in the manhunt. Initially, a satellite incident room in Coldstream coordinated the efforts of the forces involved in the hunt for Susan Maxwell's killer, with incident rooms in Leith and Portobello coordinating the search for Caroline's within hours of her body being discovered. The chief constable of all forces now involved investigating the murders agreed to appoint a senior investigating officer to coordinate the inquiries. Hector Clark, the assistant chief constable of Northumberland Police, took overall charge of the investigation. Clark established incident rooms in Northumberland and Leith police stations to liaise between the 4 police forces involved. All information relating to the child murderers was initially logged within a card filing system, but this contained 500,000 index cards relating to Susan Maxwell's case alone. Mindful of the criticisms of the recent investigation into the Yorkshire Ripper, which had become overwhelmed due to the volume of information filed in a card system, one of Clark's first decisions upon taking overall charge of the murder investigation was to introduce computer technology. Clark and other senior officers agreed this was the most efficient way to cooperate in the investigation of this scope, which all forces involved in the manhunt could access. By January 1987, All information initially linked to the murders was entered into the newly established information technology system, with £250,000 cost to implement provided by the Home Office. The database was to be called Holmes. 2.5 years later, at about 7:50 p.m. on the 26th of March 1986, a 10-year-old Sarah Jane Harper disappeared from the Leeds suburb of Morley, having left her home to buy a loaf of bread from the corner shop just 100 yards away from her home. The owner of the shop confirmed that he had seen Sarah. She had bought a loaf of bread and 2 packets of crisps from the shop at 7:55 p.m. and that a balding man had briefly entered the shop moments later, then left as Sarah made her purchases. Sarah was last seen alive by 2 girls walking into an alley leading towards the Brunswick Place home. When she had not returned by 8:20 p.m, her mother Jackie and younger sister Claire briefly searched the surrounding streets before Jackie Harper reported her daughter missing to the West Yorkshire Police. Immediately, an extensive search was launched to find her. Over 100 police officers were assigned full-time to the search, which saw house-to-house inquiries across Morley. Over 3,000 properties were searched. More than 10,000 leaflets were distributed and 1,400 witness statements obtained. A police search of the surrounding land was bolstered by 200 local volunteers, and a reservoir in nearby Tingley was searched by underwater units. Extensive inquiries by West Yorkshire Police established that a white Ford Transit van had been in the area where Sarah Harper had been abducted. 2 suspicious men had been seen loitering near the route Sarah would have taken to the corner shop, and one of them was stocky and balding. Mindful of the possibility Sarah Harper had been abducted and murdered, West Yorkshire Police dispatched a telex to all forces nationwide, requesting that they search all locations where they had previously discovered child murder victims. At a press conference on the 3rd of April, Sarah's mother Jackie informed journalists that she feared her daughter was dead and that the worst torment she and her family had endured was the uncertainty. She made a direct appeal to her daughter's abductor to reveal the whereabouts of her body. On the 19th of April, a man discovered Sarah's partially dressed, gagged and bound body floating in the River Trent near Nottingham, 71 miles, 114 kilometres from the site of her abduction. An autopsy showed she had died between 5 and 8 hours after she was last seen alive, and that the cause of death was drowning. Injuries she had received to her face, forehead and neck had most likely rendered her unconscious prior to being thrown into the water. Sarah had also been a victim of a violent and sustained sexual assault prior to being thrown into the river, causing pre-mortem internal injuries which were described by the pathologist as simply terrible. Days after Sarah's body had been found, a further witness contacted West Yorkshire Police to say that at approximately 9:15 p.m. on the 26th of March, he had seen a white van with a stocky, balding man standing by the passenger door, parked close to the River Soar. Realising the likelihood that Sarah's murderer had travelled on the M1 motorway prior to disposing her body, and that he would have had to refuel his vehicle as he made his journey, officers questioned staff at the service stations on the M1 between both West Yorkshire and Nottingham. Some staff had noticed a white transit van but couldn't give a clear description of the driver. Detective John Scunthorpe, head of the Leeds South Division of West Yorkshire Police, initially stated that he doubted Sarah Harper's disappearance was linked to those of Susan Maxwell and Caroline Hogg. In one interview, he said that although he would not discount the possibility, he believed that Sarah's abductor had a close personal connection with Morley. Upon the discovery of her body in the River Trent, he revised his opinion. On April the 21st, 1986, the head of Scotland Yard's Criminal Investigator Branch, Philip Corbett, hosted a summit meeting at Scotland Yard. to discuss how best to share information between the forces involved in the manhunt and to investigate potential links with 19 other unsolved child murders. Senior officers attended from 16 UK police forces. At this stage, the inquiries had cost in excess of £1 million. Following the murder of Sarah Harper, with 6 police forces now involved in the hunt for the offender, the police forces involved in the manhunt agreed that Hector Clark should maintain overall command of the investigation. Clark created a new headquarters in Wakefield to act as a liaison between the 6 forces. Numerous similarities linked the murder of Sarah Harper to those of Susan and Caroline. She had been prepubescent, a white female, abducted from northern England and found murdered in the Midlands. One of the outcomes of this meeting was that investigators contacted the FBI to request that they compose a psychological profile of the murderer for UK investigators. The FBI completed this profile in 1988. For the Holmes database, investigators concluded only those convicted of serial sexual offences against children would warrant further investigation. Those to be checked were to have been convicted of child murder, child abduction or attempted child abduction or indecent assault of a child. In January 1988, the UK investigators received the psychological profile of the killer from the FBI. This profile described the killer as a white male aged between 30 and 40, but closer to 40, who was a classic loner. This offender would be unkempt in appearance. He likely lived alone in rented accommodation in a lower middle class neighbourhood. This profile also deduced that the motive for the child killings was sexual, that the offender held a fixation with child pornography, that he retained souvenirs from his victims, and he most likely engaged in necrophilia with his victims' bodies shortly after their death, before disposing of them. On the 23rd of April 1988, an attempted abduction of a teenage girl occurred in Nottingham, which was not initially deemed by Nottingham police to be linked to the 3 child killings and so remained unreported to the senior investigators in the national manhunt. That evening, Teresa Thornhill had been hanging out with her friends and boyfriend in the park before walking home. The pair had parted company at the end of Norton Street when Teresa saw a blue transit van slowing down ahead of her. The driver of the van got out and raised the van's bonnet and asked Teresa, "Can you fix engines?" When Teresa replied and said that she couldn't, she began to walk away. The man clasped his arms around her mouth and navel and attempted to drag her into the vehicle. Teresa fought him off, kicking, as she attempted to free herself from what she later described as a bear hug. As her abductor fought her, Teresa squeezed his testicles, causing him to lose his grip. Teresa screamed for her mother, and at that point her boyfriend ran over, shouting, "Let her go." When the abductor heard this, he threw Teresa to the ground, sobbing, and the man rapidly drove away. Teresa ran home to her parents and called the police immediately. Both Teresa and her boyfriend described her would-be abductor as an unkempt, overweight, balding and heavily set man aged between 40 and 50 years old. 2 years later, on the 14th of July 1990, David Herx, a 53-year-old retired postmaster, was mowing his front garden when he saw a blue transit van slow to a standstill across the road. The driver got out to clean his windscreen as the neighbour's 6-year-old child passed by. As Herx stopped to clear the cuttings from his lawnmower, he saw the girl's feet lifting from the pavement and the driver sped off. Realising he had witnessed an abduction, Herx wrote down the registration number as fast as he could and ran to the girl's home. The girl's father was a police officer. Within minutes, 6 police vehicles had arrived in the village. As Herx described the man to the officers, the man drove past again in their direction. An officer jumped in front of the van's path, forcing it to stop. police removed the driver and handcuffed him. He had been caught. One of the officers, who was the father of the abducted girl, opened the van and called his daughter's name. Seeing movement in the sleeping bag, he untied its drawstring to discover his daughter inside, her wrists bound behind her back, her legs tied together, her mouth bound and gagged with a sticking plaster, and a hood tied over her head. The abductor's name was Robert Black. On the way to the station, he had said, "It was a rush of blood to the head. I've always liked little girls, ever since I was a lad. I tied her up because I wanted to keep her until later. I was going to let her go." Black claimed he had also interfered with his victim only a little. A doctor found the victim had been subject to a serious sexual assault. The girl was able to pinpoint the lay-by on the A7 where Black had sexually assaulted her. Black's intention was to move quickly and make a final scheduled delivery before further abusing his victim and almost certainly killing her. At Selkirk police station, Black, a delivery driver, admitted to sexually assaulting the girl, saying that he had not done more because he just didn't have the time. Black was charged with kidnap and held on remand. As Black awaited a scheduled court appearance, the detective superintendent noticed the similarities between the abduction of the three killings and notified Hector Clark of Black's arrest. Hector Clark interviewed Black at Edinburgh's police station. Although his answers were largely short at that point, Clark was certain that they had the right man. A search of Black's van found restraining devices including different ropes, sticking plaster, a hood, a Polaroid camera, numerous articles of girls' clothing, a mattress and a selection of sexual aids. Black claimed that on his long-distance deliveries, he would often pull into the lay-by and dress in the children's clothing for sexual gratification. He gave no plausible explanation for the sexual aids. Black's home was searched by detectives. Evidence including a large collection of child pornography in magazines, books, photographs in video format, including 58 videos and films depicting graphic child sexual abuse, which Black later claimed to have bought in the continental Europe, were also found. Black's defence lawyer ordered 2 psychiatric evaluations of Black. Both reports were uncompromising regarding Black's vile acts towards children. Black told his lawyer he intended to plead guilty to the abduction charges. On the 10th of August 1990, Black was tried for the abduction and sexual assault of the 6-year-old schoolgirl. He was tried in Edinburgh and they only lasted 1 day. In his opening statement, the defence stated his client would plead guilty to all charges. The facts of the case were stated, calling the implements found in Black's van a clear sign of premeditation and citing a medical expert's testimony that the girl would likely have suffocated within 15 minutes if she hadn't been rescued. It was heard that Black drove his victim to a lay-by to sexually abuse her and then returned through the village. In a statement read to the court, the victim stated that she didn't know the man and he was a bad man. Black stared at her before bundling her into his van. The defence stated that the abduction was unplanned and that Black had intended to release the girl after assaulting her. He pointed out that Robert Black freely admitted his paedophilic preferences and claimed to have successfully fought against these urges for years. He also said that Black accepted that he was a danger to children and wished to undergo treatment. Prior to sentencing, the judge paid tribute to Herx, the neighbour who witnessed the abduction, whose vigilance had led to Black's arrest, sentencing Black to life imprisonment for what he described as a horrific, appalling case. The judge said he was greatly influenced by the opinion of the psychiatrists, who had concluded that Black was and would remain an extreme danger to children. 2 weeks after the abduction trial, Hector Clark concluded a second interview with Black and explained to Black that he would be in no way judgmental. In the 6-hour interview, Black freely discussed his earlier sexual experiences, his experimentation with various forms of self-abuse, and his attraction towards young children. He also explained his desire for wearing young girls' clothing and admitted to having sexually assaulted in excess of 30 young girls between 1960 and 1980. He was unforthcoming when questioned about the unsolved child murders and disappearances. In the latter stages of the interview, Hector Clark steered his questioning towards the child abduction and murder, specifically in relation to the murder of Caroline Hogg, informing Black that police had already established that he had been in Portobello on the date of Caroline Hogg's abduction. Black was told that they had eyewitness accounts at the petrol station and also receipts proving where he was at the time. Black's replies then became evasive and abrupt. He was directly asked at the end of the interview to confess in order to end the suffering of the victims' families. He did not respond. Despite the fact that the information gleaned in this interview did little to advance the murder inquiry, upon conclusion of the interview, Hector Clark stated, "That's our man. I'd bet my life on it." Investigators discovered that Black had made scheduled delivery runs to the areas where the abductions had occurred on the relevant dates, and although the precise times he had been in the areas were difficult to adduce, petrol receipts confirmed he had bought fuel close to where each child had been abducted on the date of their disappearance. For example, on the date of Sarah Harper's disappearance, Black's 2 final deliveries on his schedule had been in West Yorkshire, which was his final delivery in Morley, just 150 yards away from Sarah's home. Black had refuelled his van between the 2 destinations shortly before Harper had been last seen alive. In March 1992, prosecution lawyers decided that they had sufficient evidence to try Robert Black for the 3 murders and attempted abduction of Teresa Thornhill. At a news conference held on the 11th of March, Hector Clark informed the press that the criminal proceedings had been issued at the authority of the Crown Prosecution Service against Robert Black. Black's defence counsel wanted their client to be tried on each count separately, and said the prosecution should not be allowed to demonstrate any similarity between the modus operandi of each offence at the upcoming trial. In pre-trial, the judge ruled against the defence motions to try Black on each charge separately, and also ruled to allow the prosecution to submit similar fact evidence between the cases. This ruling allowed the prosecution to make these similarities between the cases known and to introduce into evidence Black's previous sexual assaults, of which there were many. On the 13th of April 1994, Robert Black stood trial. He pleaded not guilty to each of the 10 charges of kidnap, murder, attempted kidnap, and preventing the lawful burial of a body. In his opening statement on behalf of the Crown, the prosecutor described the case as every parent's nightmare. He outlined the prosecution's contention that Robert Black had committed the 3 child murders and attempted abductions, and that he was already serving a life sentence for one of these abductions. Each abduction and murder was outlined to the jury, explaining that each victim had remained alive in Black's van for several hours before their murder, and that each had been killed near the location from where their bodies were found. The prosecutor contended that Black had kidnapped each victim for his own sexual gratification and pointed out Black's extensive record of sexual abuse towards children and the paraphernalia that was discovered in his London home. On the second day of trial, the prosecution began to introduce witnesses. Witnesses described the different circumstances surrounding the abductions and the discovery of each victim. Investigators described the evidence that uncovered Black's movements on the dates of each abduction and attempted abductions. Contemporary statements made by the mother of each murder victims at the time of the child abductions were also read out in court, alongside testimony from the pathologist who had examined the bodies. Upon hearing the details of the kidnaps and murders, relatives of the 3 murder victims wept openly in court. Black rarely displayed any interest throughout the proceedings, typically remaining expressionless. On the 12th of May, both the defence and the prosecution delivered their closing arguments to the jury. The prosecutor argued first, opening his final address to the jury by describing the circumstances of Black's 1990 arrest and recounting the extensive circumstantial evidence presented throughout the trial. The underlining the fact that no physical evidence existed due to the break between the offences of Black's arrest were also described. The defence's closing argument began by asking the jury, "Where is the jury that will acquit a pervert of multiple murder?" before describing his client as someone against whom ample prejudice existed, but no actual hard evidence. It was stated that it was necessary to differentiate between child sexual perverts and alleged child killers, and the police had become exhausted by the investigation, so had become fixated on pinning the crimes on Black. The judge delivered his final instructions to the jury. In his final address, he advised the jury to disregard any emotion or personal dislike for Black's extensive history of sexual offences against children when considering their verdict, and not to prejudice his guilt because of his 1990 conviction of the abduction of the sexual assault of the schoolgirl. He further directed the jury to instead focus on the evidence presented at trial and decide whether the interlocking similarities between the cases were sufficient to convince them of Black's guilt. The deliberation took only 2 days. On the 19th of May, the jury found Black guilty of all 3 counts of kidnapping, 3 counts of murder, 3 counts of preventing the lawful burial of a body, and 1 count of attempted abduction. He was sentenced to a term of life imprisonment for each of these counts, which recommended that he serve a minimum of 35 years on each of the 3 murder charges. Black remained unmoved upon the receipt of the sentence. He turned round towards all the police that had worked on his case and said, "Tremendous, well done, boys." Black was then taken to a Category A prison. Hector Clark later stated, "The tragedy is these 3 beautiful children who should never have died. Black is the most evil of characters, and I hope there is not now or ever another one like him." When asked his personal feelings towards Robert Black, Clark stated, "Black is a man of the most evil kind, but no longer important to me. I care not about him." Up until 2009, no connection had been made between Black and Jennifer Cardy, but on the 15th of December 2009, Black was served with a summons to attend trial in Northern Ireland for the 1981 murder of Jennifer. He was charged the following day. Black's trial for sexual assault and the murder of Jennifer Cardy began on the 22nd of September 2011. He was tried and acknowledged that he may have been in the area of Northern Ireland on the date of Jennifer's abduction, but pleaded not guilty to the charges. Prosecutors introduced into evidence petrol receipts proving that Black had been near Ballinderry on the date of Jennifer's abduction. Further evidence presented at trial included a salary ledger proving Black had been paid £50, which had only been given to the drivers from the firm that made the deliveries to Northern Ireland. Records also showed that on the night of the abduction, Black had boarded an overnight ferry from Northern Ireland to Liverpool before refuelling his van in Coventry the day before, en route to his home in London. To further support the prosecution's case that Jennifer's murder had been committed by Black, the forensic pathologist testified to the similarities between Jennifer's abduction and murder and those of Sarah Harper. He testified that the circumstances of the girls' deaths were remarkably similar, and the injuries inflicted upon these girls strongly suggested both girls had been alive, albeit unconscious, at the point of their deaths when they were placed in the water. After the 6-week trial, the jury deliberated for only 4 hours. Black was given a further life sentence after he was found guilty. The 8-year nationwide inquiry, which saw the 1990 arrest of Robert Black, proved to be one of the longest and most costly in British history. By the time the investigators amassed sufficient evidence to convince the Crown to investigate criminal proceedings against Black, the total cost for the inquiry is estimated at £12 million. On the 12th of January 2016, Robert Black died from a heart attack in prison. His body was cremated just outside Belfast. No family or friends were present at the service. Black's ashes were scattered in the sea, as none of his family members wanted them. Police believe that Black had committed more murders than just the 4 he was convicted of, with senior detectives believing the true number of his victims had been at least 8. Black had been linked to 13 further child murders and disappearances across the UK, Ireland and continental Europe, committed between 1969 and 1987. I have listed all of the suspected victims of Robert Black's in the description. Thank you for listening to my first ever video, and I really hope you liked it. I hope to make many more. Please like and subscribe if you liked the video, and let me know what you think in the comment section. I have very thick skin. See you later.